They laughed when Wyatt Hale handed his last drop of water to a man no one else would touch. But by sunrise, those same men stood silent as the United States Army raised their hands in salute to him. The dust in Dry Creek hung low that afternoon, thick as flour and just as dry, clinging to boots, to coats, to the back of a man's throat until every breath tasted like the land itself was trying to swallow him whole. Wyatt Hale rode in slow, his old bay horse favoring its left leg, the rhythm uneven but steady enough to carry them the last mile into town. He hadn't had a proper drink since early morning, just a careful sip from a dented canteen that now felt lighter than it should. Too light. The kind of light that makes a man check twice, even when he already knows the truth. He tied off outside the saloon, not because he had money for whiskey, but because shade was shade, and a wooden overhang in this heat felt like mercy. Inside, laughter spilled out. Cards slapping tables, boots scraping, voices thick with the kind of ease that comes from full bellies and full glasses. Wyatt didn't go in. He stayed where he was, one hand resting on the worn leather strap of his canteen, thumb tracing the edge of the cap like it might somehow refill itself if he waited long enough. That's when he heard it. Not loud, not begging, just a voice that had been used too little for too long. "Water, if you got it." Wyatt turned. The man sat low against the side wall, half in shadow, half in sun, like the building itself hadn't decided whether to claim him or cast him off. Clothes torn, boots near falling apart, beard tangled with dust. The kind of figure most folks learn not to see. A few men stepped around him without breaking stride. One of them nudged him with the toe of his boot, not hard, just enough to move him out of the way like a sack left where it didn't belong. The man didn't protest, didn't reach out, just sat there, breathing shallow, eyes fixed somewhere past the street, like he'd already walked farther than anyone else in that town ever would. Wyatt looked down at his canteen. He knew exactly how much was left in it. Enough to get him home if he was careful, not enough to waste. The sun pressed down harder, heat rising off the ground in waves you could almost see, bending the air, warping the distance. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He could already feel the ache behind his eyes, the slow warning of what came next if he didn't drink soon. Behind him, a voice called out, amused, careless. "Don't tell me you're thinking about sharing that, Hale." A few chuckles followed. Wyatt didn't answer. He stepped forward instead, boots crunching softly in the dirt, each step slower than the last like something inside him was measuring the cost. The man's eyes shifted then, finally landing on Wyatt. They weren't desperate. That was the strange part. Just tired. Deep tired. The kind that didn't ask for much because it didn't expect to get it. Wyatt crouched, one knee hitting the dirt, the smell of hot wood and dust filling his lungs. He unscrewed the cap. The faint slosh inside sounded louder than it should have. Final. He lifted the canteen, pausing just long enough to feel the heat on the back of his neck, the weight of the watching eyes behind him, the quiet calculation of men who had already decided what kind of fool he was about to be. Then he tipped it forward. "Easy," he said, voice low, steady. The man drank in small pulls, careful, like he understood exactly what he'd been given. A drop slipped down his chin, cutting a clean line through the dust. Wyatt didn't rush him, didn't look back. He just held the canteen there until the last of it was gone, until the hollow sound told him there was nothing left to give. The laughter behind him had faded. Not gone, just thinner now, stretched tight with something harder to name. Wyatt pulled the canteen back, gave it a small shake out of habit. Empty. He capped it anyway. The man drew a slow breath, shoulders rising, then settling. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man looked at him, really looked this time, and there was something in that gaze that didn't fit the rags, didn't fit the dust, didn't fit the way the town had already dismissed him. "Son," he said quietly, voice steadier now, "you just gave away something most men would have sold." Wyatt shrugged once. "A small motion. Wasn't mine to keep if you needed it more." The man held his eyes a second longer, like he was weighing that answer, turning it over, committing it to memory. Then he nodded, just once. "We'll see about that." Wyatt stood, dusted off his knee, and turned back toward his horse, the empty canteen tapping softly against his side with each step. Behind him, the man leaned back into the shade, closing his eyes like the sun no longer had a claim on him. And somewhere above the rooftops, the sky stretched wide and silent, holding its breath like it knew something the town didn't. Not yet. Wyatt did not head back to town after that. Not right away. Because a man learns to listen to the land before he listens to people, and the land was telling him he had made his day harder than it needed to be. The trail out of Dry Creek stretched long and pale under the late afternoon sun, a thin ribbon cutting through scrub and stone, and every step his horse took kicked up dust that clung to his tongue like dry ash. He reached for the canteen out of habit more than hope, gave it a small tilt, and heard nothing but the hollow knock of empty metal. He let it hang again. The weight of it was wrong now. Too light to be trusted. Too honest to ignore. He rode slow, not because he wanted to, but because pushing a tired horse with a bad leg under that kind of heat was the kind of mistake that cost more than pride. The wind came in short breaths, warm and restless, carrying the faint smell of dry grass and distant cattle, but no hint of water. Not a creek, not a pond, not even the promise of one. Just miles of land that did not care whether a man made it home or not. By the time the sun dipped lower, Wyatt could feel the dryness working deeper, turning his thoughts slow, stretching time in a way that made each mile feel longer than the last. He leaned forward in the saddle, resting a hand on the horse's neck, feeling the steady heat of it, the quiet strength that did not ask questions. Just a little farther, he murmured, though he was not sure if he was speaking to the horse or to himself. Behind him, Dry Creek had already begun to shrink into memory, but inside that town the story he left behind was growing legs. In the saloon, Buck Moran leaned back in his chair, boots propped up, telling the tale again for anyone who had not heard it the first time. He made it bigger each telling, louder, meaner, turning Wyatt's quiet act into something worth laughing at. Man gives away his last water to a stranger who looks like he crawled out of a ditch, Buck said, shaking his head like it offended him personally. That is not kindness. That is stupidity dressed up like virtue. A few men laughed, though not as hard as before. Martha Keene wiped down the bar slower than usual, her eyes drifting once toward the door, like she half expected to see the old man still sitting there. Sheriff Tom Bell stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the street with a look that said he was thinking more than he was speaking. You ever notice, he said after a while, voice low, that not all beggars carry themselves the same? Buck scoffed. A beggar is a beggar, Sheriff. You give them one thing, they come back for 10. The sheriff did not answer right away. He just kept looking out, remembering something he could not quite place, something about the way that old man had sat, not slumped, not broken, just waiting, like a man used to being heard, even when no one was listening. Outside, the place where the old man had been was empty now, no mark left behind except a faint scuff in the dirt and a silence that felt different from the rest of the street. Back on the trail, Wyatt finally reached the low rise that marked the edge of his land, if a man could call a stretch of dry earth and a leaning shack his own. The boards creaked when he pushed the door open, the inside cooler by only a few degrees, but enough to feel like relief. He moved to the corner where a rain barrel sat, lifted the lid, and stared down into the shallow pool at the bottom. Not much. Enough to keep a man going if he did not waste it. He dipped a tin cup, drank slow, letting the water sit in his mouth before swallowing, making it last in a way that felt almost like respect. Then he set the cup down and lowered himself onto the small wooden chair by the door, the kind that wobbled if you shifted too quick. Evening settled in quiet around him, the sky turning from hard blue to a softer shade that stretched wide over the land. Crickets began their steady rhythm, and somewhere far off a coyote called once, then fell silent. Wyatt leaned back, eyes half closed, but sleep did not come easy. Not with the memory of that man's voice still sitting clear in his mind. Not with the way those eyes had looked at him, steady and sure, like the moment had mattered more than it should have. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the grit of the day still there, and let out a slow breath. Tomorrow would be the same as any other. Work if he could find it. Ride if he had to. Keep moving. That was how a man like him got by. He did not know that before the sun would clear the horizon, the quiet of that land would be broken by the sound of many horses, moving with purpose, carrying something far bigger than anything that had ever stopped at his door before. The first sound came before the light, low and distant, a rhythm that did not belong to wind or cattle or anything that drifted without purpose across open land. Wyatt stirred in the chair by his door, not fully awake, not fully asleep, The kind of half-rest a man falls into when his body is tired but his mind has not yet let go. Then it came again, clearer this time, steady and deliberate, like something counting the ground one step at a time. Hoofbeats. More than one. Wyatt opened his eyes slowly, not with panic, just with the quiet attention of someone who had lived long enough out here to know that nothing came riding in numbers before sunrise without reason. The air inside the shack felt different, cooler, holding the last breath of night. But outside the horizon was beginning to pale, a thin line of gray pushing against the dark. He stood, joints stiff, and stepped out onto the small porch, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe as he looked east. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the wide stretch of land rolling out in silence, the kind of silence that made a man think he had imagined the sound. Then the dust appeared. Not a storm, not scattered. A line, low at first, then rising, catching what little light there was and holding it. Wyatt narrowed his eyes. The rhythm came again, closer now, layered, many hooves moving together in a pace that did not wander or hesitate. This was not travelers. This was formation. He stepped down into the dirt, boots pressing into the cool ground, and reached for the brim of his hat, pulling it lower as if that might sharpen the distance. As the light grew, shapes began to form inside the dust, dark figures moving in unison, the faint glint of metal catching the early dawn. Horses, many of them, riders sitting straight, not loose like ranch hands, not restless like drifters. Still, measured, the kind of still that came from discipline, not comfort. Wyatt felt something shift in his chest, not fear, not yet, just a quiet awareness that whatever was coming had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with something larger than a man who owned little more than a shack and a tired horse. Back in Dry Creek, the same sound rolled in a few minutes later, echoing down the main street before most folks had even poured their first cup of coffee. Doors opened. Heads turned. Martha Keene stepped out from the saloon, apron still tied, wiping her hands on a cloth as she squinted toward the road. Sheriff Bell moved out from his office, hat already on, posture straightening in a way that had nothing to do with habit and everything to do with recognition. He knew that sound. He had heard it years ago, when lines of riders meant orders, meant structure, meant something the town itself could not control. Buck Moran stepped out last, slower than the others, a smirk still half resting on his face from the night before, but it faded as he followed their gaze. The dust line grew, the shapes becoming clearer, uniforms taking form where shadows had been. A flag moved at the front, catching the morning light just enough to show its colors, muted but unmistakable. No one spoke. They did not need to. The meaning of it rode in with the sound. Back at the shack, Wyatt did not move from where he stood. He watched as the column approached, the distance closing yard by yard, until he could see the details that made it real. Saddles polished, boots clean despite the miles, faces set in a calm that did not wander. At the front rode a young officer, posture straight, eyes forward, a folded paper held carefully in his hand like it mattered more than the miles behind him. Wyatt's horse shifted slightly behind him, sensing something different in the air, but did not pull away. The riders slowed as they neared, not stopping yet, just easing into a pace that matched the ground, the kind of approach that said they had already decided where they were going before they ever set out. Wyatt's mind moved through possibilities, none of them settling long enough to feel certain. He had no debts that called for a column, no trouble that traveled in lines, no reason for men like that to know his name. The officer raised one hand slightly, and the line responded without a word, the entire formation adjusting as one, dust settling around them in soft waves as they came to a stop just beyond the edge of Wyatt's small clearing. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. No orders shouted. No movement rushed. Just the quiet presence of many men and horses standing in place. The early morning light catching on buttons and buckles, turning the scene into something almost unreal against the simple frame of Wyatt's weathered shack. Then the officer guided his horse forward a few steps, closing the last distance alone, and looked down at Wyatt with an expression that was not hard, not soft, just precise. He unfolded the paper, glanced at it once, then back at Wyatt, as if confirming something he had already been told. "Wyatt Hale," he said, voice clear in the still air, not a question, but not yet a command. Wyatt nodded once, slow, the motion small but certain. The officer studied him for a brief second longer, then gave a slight nod of his own, like a man checking off the final piece of a long journey. Behind him, the line of riders remained perfectly still, waiting, as if the next moment depended entirely on what had already happened the day before, in a place most of them had never seen, involving a man most of them had never met. The officer did not raise his voice, and he did not need to, because the kind of silence that stood behind him carried more weight than any command ever could. Wyatt felt it before he understood it. The way the air itself seemed to settle, as if every man in that line had agreed, without speaking, that whatever came next would be witnessed, not rushed. The young lieutenant studied him for another second, then folded the paper with care, not like a message to be discarded, but like something already fulfilled. "Sir," the officer said, straightening slightly in the saddle, "we have been instructed to locate you at first light." Wyatt shifted his weight just a fraction, boots firm in the dirt, his hand resting near his belt out of habit, not threat. "You found me," he replied, voice steady, though there was a quiet edge of confusion beneath it. "What for?" The officer did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his head just enough to glance back over his shoulder. That single motion moved through the line like a signal carried on wind. Horses adjusted. Leather creaked softly. And then, from the center of the formation, a second rider began to move forward, slower than the first. Older, not in years alone, but in the way he held himself, the way his presence did not need to be announced because it was already known. Wyatt watched as the man approached, the morning light catching on the edges of his coat, now clean, now fitted, now unmistakably military. The dust was gone from his face. The beard had been trimmed. And yet, even before the distance closed, Wyatt knew. Not from the uniform, not from the way the other men seemed to hold themselves around him, but from the eyes. The same steady gaze, the same quiet weight behind it. The man guided his horse to a stop a few feet away, looking down at Wyatt not with authority first, but with recognition. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved lightly across the open land, brushing past the boards of the shack, carrying the faint scent of sun-warmed earth. Then the older man inclined his head, just slightly, as if greeting someone he had already met in a place far less formal. "You look better when you are not." Half buried in dust, Wyatt said before he could stop himself. A faint smile touched the man's face, small but real. "And you look exactly the same," he replied. "Which is to say, unchanged by the opinions of others." Wyatt let out a quiet breath, something between a laugh and disbelief. "You ride a long way just to say thank you?" The man studied him for a moment, then shook his head once. "No," he said. "I rode a long way to see if what I was told about you was true." Wyatt frowned slightly. "What you were told?" The man shifted in the saddle, then glanced once more at the line of soldiers behind him before returning his gaze to Wyatt. That in a town full of men with full canteens, one man with an empty one chose to give instead of keep. The words settled between them, simple, direct, carrying more than just memory. Wyatt shrugged, the motion small. "It was water," he said. "A man was thirsty." The older man's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, not in judgment, but in understanding. "That is what makes it rare," he said quietly. He drew a slow breath, then turned slightly in the saddle, just enough for the men behind him to see his profile. The shift was subtle, but it carried meaning. The line responded without hesitation. Boots aligned, shoulders squared. A stillness settled over them that was no longer just discipline, but preparation. Wyatt felt it again, that quiet pressure in the air, like the moment before something important is spoken aloud. He glanced from the man in front of him to the soldiers behind, then back again. "You still have not told me why you are here," he said. The man looked down at him, and for the first time, there was something unmistakable in his voice. Not authority alone, not gratitude alone, but respect. "Because," he said, "there are not many men left who understand the value of something when they are the ones who need it most." He paused, just long enough for the meaning to settle, then lifted his chin slightly. The lieutenant straightened instantly, and without a word shouted, without a signal given beyond that single movement, the entire line of soldiers brought their hands up in unison, a clean, deliberate motion that cut through the quiet morning. Like a line drawn in stone. Wyatt did not move. He did not raise his hand. He did not step forward or back. He simply stood there, hat low, eyes steady, as 100 men in uniform held their salute for him, not for rank, not for command, but for something no uniform could give. And in that moment, the land seemed to hold still around them, as if even the wind understood that what had begun with a single cup of water had become something far larger than any of them had expected. The salute did not drop right away, and that was the part that stayed with Wyatt longer than the movement itself, because men like that did not hold a gesture unless it meant something. And this one was held just long enough to make it clear that whatever had happened yesterday had been seen, weighed, and decided upon by people who did not hand out respect lightly. Wyatt shifted his stance slightly, not out of discomfort, but because standing still under that kind of attention felt heavier than any work he had done in the sun. The older man, no longer just a stranger, no longer just a figure in dust, lowered his hand first, and the line followed as one, the motion clean, precise, and final. The silence that came after felt different, fuller, like something had been placed into the space and left there on purpose. Wyatt exhaled slowly, then looked up at him again. "You still have not told me your name," he said. The man regarded him for a moment, then reached up and removed his glove, a small gesture that carried more weight than it needed to. "Gideon Vale," he said. "General, United States Army." The title did not come out sharp or proud. It came out simple, like a fact that did not need to be proven. Wyatt nodded once, taking it in without widening his eyes or stepping back, which seemed to interest the general more than if he had reacted otherwise. "You were not what you looked like yesterday," Wyatt said. Gideon Vale allowed the faintest hint of a smile again. "Most men are not," he replied. "The difference is whether someone chooses to look twice." Wyatt glanced past him at the line of soldiers, then back. "And this?" he asked. "All this riding just to find me?" The general shifted slightly in the saddle, then gestured once toward the land around them, the dry stretch, the small shack, the barrel with barely enough water to reflect the sky. "I have been traveling through settlements like yours for months," he said. "Not as a general. As a man no one would bother to notice. I wanted to see what remained when rank was taken away, what men did when there was nothing to gain." Wyatt listened, quiet, his expression unchanged, but his eyes sharper now. "And?" he asked. Gideon Vale's gaze moved briefly toward the horizon, then returned. "Most walked past," he said. "Some laughed. A few pretended not to see me at all. That is the easier way, you understand. To tell yourself that a man on the ground belongs there." The words were not spoken with bitterness, just clarity. "But you did not," he continued. Wyatt shrugged again, that same small motion. "He was thirsty," he said. "I had water." The general nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something deeper than it sounded. "You had very little water," he corrected gently. "And yet you gave it away." Wyatt looked down briefly at the canteen hanging at his side, then back up. "It did not seem like a thing to measure," he said. "Either a man needs it, or he does not." Gideon Vale studied him in silence for a few seconds, then reached down toward his saddle and pulled free a small leather case. He opened it with care, revealing a polished insignia, simple but unmistakable in its design. Not ornate, not meant for display, meant to be earned. He held it out, not forcing it, just offering it. "There are many ways a man can serve," he said. "Some wear a uniform, some do not. But the ones who understand what you understood yesterday are the ones we trust when things do not go as planned." Wyatt did not take it immediately. He looked at the insignia, then at the general's hand, then back at the man himself. "You are offering me a place with your men," he said. It was not a question. Gideon Vale inclined his head slightly. "I am offering you a chance to stand where that instinct of yours matters," he said. "Guiding supply lines. Helping settlements that do not yet know how close they are to running dry. Places where a single decision, a single act, can mean the difference between holding together and falling apart." The wind moved again, light but steady, brushing against Wyatt's coat, carrying with it the dry scent of the land that had shaped him. He let out a slow breath, then reached up and touched the edge of the insignia with 2 fingers, not taking it yet, just feeling the weight of what it represented. "And if I say no?" he asked. Gideon Vale did not hesitate. "Then nothing changes," he said. "You go on as you have, and I ride on knowing I met a man who did the right thing without needing a reason beyond the moment itself." Wyatt's eyes held his for a second longer, Then he closed his hand around the insignia at last, not gripping it tight, just holding it like it belonged there. He did not smile. He did not stand taller. But something in the way he breathed shifted, quieter, steadier. "I will not wear a uniform," he said. Gideon Vale nodded. "I would not ask you to," he replied. Wyatt looked past him once more, at the line of soldiers, at the order and stillness that defined them, then back at the man who had sat in the dust the day before. "But I will ride," he added. The general's expression settled into something that was not relief, not pride, just recognition. "That is all I needed to hear," he said. And somewhere behind them, the sun finally broke over the horizon, spilling light across the land in a way that made everything look the same as it had the day before, and completely different at the same time. The insignia felt heavier once it was in Wyatt's hand, not because of the metal itself, but because of what it carried with it, a quiet weight that did not press down, but settled in, like something choosing to stay. He turned it once between his fingers, watching how the early light caught along its edge, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat without ceremony, without display. Gideon Vale watched that small decision with the same steady attention he had given everything else, as if even the absence of pride was something worth noting. The line of soldiers behind him remained still, but there was a subtle shift now, not in posture, but in presence. Like men who understood that something had just changed direction without a single order being spoken. Wyatt stepped off the porch, boots landing firm in the dirt, and walked toward his horse, running a hand along the animal's neck in a familiar motion that grounded him more than anything else in that moment. The horse flicked an ear, then settled, accepting the touch the way it always had, without question. Wyatt checked the saddle, tightened a strap that did not need tightening, then paused with his hand resting on the worn leather, eyes moving once across the land that had been his world for longer than he cared to count. It looked the same, dry, open, unchanged. But there was a difference now, not in the land, but in the way he stood in it. Behind him, Gideon Vale turned slightly in the saddle and spoke, not loudly, but with the kind of clarity that carried through men trained to listen. "We move east by mid-morning," he said. "Supply route runs 40 miles past the ridge, then splits toward 3 settlements. Water is short in all of them." The lieutenant nodded once, already understanding, already adjusting in his mind the distances, the pace, the order of travel. No one rushed. No one questioned. Orders here did not need force. They needed only to be heard. Wyatt listened without turning, taking in the distances, measuring them against what he knew of the terrain, the dry washes, the places where water might still hold if a man knew where to look. "There is a cut about 12 miles out," he said after a moment, still facing his horse. "Looks like nothing from a distance. Drops into a narrow channel. Holds water longer than it should after rain." Gideon Vale's gaze shifted to him. "You have used it?" he asked. Wyatt nodded once. More than once. The general inclined his head slightly, as if another piece had fallen into place exactly where it belonged. "Then you will ride point," he said. It was not a command sharpened by authority. It was a statement shaped by trust. Wyatt turned then, meeting his gaze. "I will ride ahead," he said. "I do not ride above." For a brief second, something like approval flickered in Gideon Vale's eyes. "Ahead is enough," he replied. The wind picked up slightly, moving through the line of horses, stirring coats, brushing against the edges of uniforms, carrying with it the same dry scent that had been there the day before, and the day before that, and would be there long after they were gone. Wyatt reached up, took hold of the saddle horn, and pulled himself up in one smooth motion, settling into the seat like he had never left it. The familiar creak of leather, the shift of weight, the quiet balance between man and animal, all of it returned without thought. He adjusted his hat, then looked out toward the ridge Gideon Vale had mentioned, the line of land faint in the distance, waiting. Back in Dry Creek, the town had not returned to its usual rhythm. Not yet. Men stood in small groups along the street, voices lower than before, eyes turning again and again toward the direction of Wyatt's place, as if trying to understand how a man they had barely noticed could suddenly be the center of something they did not control. Buck Moran leaned against a post, arms crossed, jaw set tighter than it had been the night before, the easy laughter gone, replaced by something quieter, something that did not sit well. Sheriff Bell stood a few steps away, watching the same horizon, his expression unreadable, but his silence heavier than any words he could have chosen. Martha Keene wiped the same spot on her bar for longer than necessary, her thoughts somewhere beyond the walls of her saloon. Out there, beyond the edge of town, Wyatt shifted his weight slightly in the saddle and gave his horse a gentle nudge forward. The animal moved, not fast, not slow, just steady, stepping out ahead of the line as if it had always been meant to lead. Behind him, the column began to follow, the sound of hooves rising again, but different now, not approaching, not arriving, but moving with purpose towards something that had not yet been seen. Wyatt did not look back. He did not need to. The land stretched out in front of him, wide and unspoken, and for the first time in a long while, the path he rode did not feel like something he was surviving. It felt like something he had chosen. The land opened wider as Wyatt rode ahead, the ridge rising slow and steady in the distance like something that had been waiting long before any of them had decided to cross it, and the sound behind him settled into a rhythm that no longer felt foreign, just present, like a second heartbeat keeping time with his own. He did not push the pace. Out here, speed was a mistake a man paid for later. Instead, he let the horse choose a steady line, weaving through patches of dry brush, skirting low ground where the earth cracked in long, tired lines that told stories of water that had once been there and was now gone. The sun climbed higher, losing the softness of morning, turning sharp again, pressing heat down on his shoulders, on his hats, onto the backs of horses that carried more than their share without complaint. Wyatt lifted his gaze toward the ridge, then slightly to the left, adjusting their path by a few yards, then a few more, subtle shifts that would not mean much to anyone watching from a distance, but would make all the difference when the ground changed underfoot. Behind him, Lieutenant Samuel Pierce rode a short distance back, not close enough to crowd, not far enough to lose sight, his attention moving between Wyatt and the terrain, learning without asking, observing the way a man who had not grown up on land like this learned to read it. "You favor the higher ground," the lieutenant called forward after a while, voice carrying just enough to reach without breaking the quiet. Wyatt did not turn. "High ground shows you where not to go," he replied. "Low ground tells you where you are already too late." The lieutenant considered that, then nodded to himself, storing it away like a piece of instruction that did not come from any book he had studied. The column followed, adjusting to Wyatt's line, the formation stretching slightly where the land demanded it, then tightening again where the ground allowed, a living shape that responded without losing its purpose. Hours passed in that rhythm, the kind that made time feel less like something measured and more like something endured. The heat deepened, drawing moisture from skin, from breath, from thought, until even conversation felt like a thing that cost too much to spend. Wyatt reached for the canteen at his side once, out of habit, then stopped before his fingers closed around it, remembering, letting his hand fall away. He did not need it now. Not yet. He knew where they were going. That knowledge held him steadier than water could have. The ridge drew closer, its shadow offering a promise of relief that was still a mile out, maybe more. As they approached, the ground began to change, the flat stretch giving way to uneven stone, patches of earth broken by narrow cuts that ran like veins through the land. Wyatt slowed, raising a hand slightly without looking back. The movement passed through the line, speed dropping, hoofs finding more careful footing. He guided his horse along a line that seemed almost wrong at first glance, angling away from the most direct path, leading them toward a shallow dip that did not look like anything worth noticing. Lieutenant Pierce frowned slightly as he followed, eyes scanning for reason. "That is not the shortest way," he said. Wyatt shook his head once. "Shortest way is not always the way that keeps men standing," he replied. They reached the edge of the dip, and from there the land fell away more sharply than it had seemed from above, opening into a narrow channel carved by water that had not run in weeks, maybe months, but had left its mark all the same. The air felt different there, cooler by just enough to matter. Wyatt dismounted without hurry, boots hitting the ground, and walked a few steps down into the channel, kneeling near a bend where the earth darkened slightly. He pressed his fingers into the soil, then deeper, feeling past the dry crust until he found what he had been looking for. Moisture. Not visible, not obvious, but there. He looked up at the line of men and horses waiting above, their stillness now edged with expectation. "We dig here," he said simply. There was no doubt in his voice, No need to explain further. Gideon Vale guided his horse forward, stopping at the edge, looking down at Wyatt, then at the ground, then back again. How long? He asked. Wyatt stood, brushing dirt from his hands. Not long, he said, if we do not waste time. The general nodded once, then turned slightly, issuing a few quiet instructions that moved through the line with practiced ease. Men dismounted. Tools were brought forward. No one questioned the choice of place. Not after what they had already seen. Wyatt stepped back up the slope, returning to his horse, watching. As the first shovels broke the surface, the sound of metal meeting earth carrying through the channel in steady rhythm. He did not join them right away. He stood there, hat low, eyes steady, measuring not the work, but the men, the way they moved, the way they trusted a direction given without proof. Behind them, the ridge cast a longer shadow now, stretching across the land they had crossed, covering the path that had led them here, as if to say that what mattered was no longer where they had come from, but what they would find if they kept going. The first few strikes of metal into earth sounded dull, resisted, like the ground itself was deciding whether it would give anything back at all, and for a moment it seemed as though Wyatt might have led them to nothing more than another dry promise in a land full of them. The men worked without complaint, though, steady and methodical, each motion measured, each shovel turning over the hard-packed soil inch by inch as the sun climbed higher and pressed down harder. Dust lifted with every strike, fine and pale, settling over sleeves and boots, clinging to skin the same way it had the day before in Dry Creek. Only now no one laughed. No one spoke carelessly, because the difference between empty ground and hidden water was not something a man joked about when he was miles from the nearest well. Wyatt stood just above the channel, one hand resting lightly on the saddle horn, watching not the speed of their work, but the depth, the angle, the way the earth changed color as they went down. At 3 inches, nothing. At 6, still dry. At 9, a shift so slight most men would have missed it, the dirt darker by a shade, the resistance softer, the smell faintly different, less like dust, and more like something that remembered what it had once held. Keep going, Wyatt said, voice low but certain. No one questioned him. The rhythm continued, steady, patient, until one of the men paused, lifting his shovel with a small hesitation. The soil clung to the metal differently now, heavier, thicker. He looked down, then back up toward the lieutenant. Sir, he said, not loud, but enough. Lieutenant Pierce stepped forward, crouching near the edge, reaching down with his hand, pressing into the loosened earth. For a second, there was nothing. Then his fingers sank just a little deeper than expected. He drew them back slowly. Damp. Not wet enough to shine, but wet enough to matter. He looked up, and for the first time since they had left the shack, there was something in his expression that was not discipline or calculation. It was relief, quiet and contained, but real. Another foot, Wyatt said, already knowing. The men resumed, quicker now, not reckless, but with purpose sharpened by proof. The ground gave way easier with each layer, the resistance lessening, the color deepening, until finally, with one more turn of the shovel, the earth shifted and a small, dark pocket formed where the soil could no longer hold what lay beneath. It did not burst. It did not rush. It seeped. Slow at first, then steadier, a thin line of water finding its way through the loosened ground, gathering into a shallow pool that caught the light like something almost sacred. No one spoke for a moment. The sound of it, soft, persistent, filled the space where the digging had been. Then Gideon Vale guided his horse down the slope, dismounted, and stepped toward the edge of the small pool, looking down at it with the same attention he had given everything else, as if even this simple emergence deserved to be witnessed fully. He knelt, removing his glove again, and dipped his fingers into the water, lifting them slightly, letting the drops fall back in a quiet rhythm. You knew, he said, not looking up. Wyatt shook his head once. I knew it could be there, he replied. That is different. The general glanced up at him then, a faint crease at the corner of his eyes. Most men would have called that the same thing, he said. Wyatt stepped down into the channel, boots pressing into the softened earth, and crouched near the edge, watching the water gather. Most men do not spend enough time being wrong to learn the difference, he said. A few of the soldiers shifted slightly, exchanging brief looks, not in doubt, but in recognition of something that was not written in any manual they had followed. Canteens were brought forward, filled carefully, not rushed, each man taking only what he needed, passing it along without word, the quiet discipline of shared necessity replacing any thought of taking more than his share. Lieutenant Pierce stood back for a moment, watching the line, then looked toward Wyatt. "You said there were 3 settlements," he said. Wyatt nodded. "There are," he replied. "And this is only enough to get us to the next one." The lieutenant's gaze moved from the water to the horizon, measuring the distance again, recalculating in light of what they now had. Gideon Vale rose slowly, wiping his hand dry against a cloth, then turned to face the men. "We do not take more than we need," he said, voice carrying with quiet authority. "We leave the rest for those who may come after." It was not a new rule. But here, in this place, after what they had just seen, it felt less like an order and more like a reflection of something they had already been shown. Wyatt filled his own canteen last, lifting it slightly, feeling the weight return, heavier now, honest again. He did not drink immediately. He held it for a second, then looked out toward the ridge beyond, the path that still stretched ahead, unseen but waiting. Behind him, the small pool continued to gather, quiet and steady, a reminder that sometimes what saved a man was not what he could see, but what he chose to trust before it revealed itself. They did not rush away from the water, and that was the first sign that something had settled differently among them, because men who had known thirst long enough usually drank fast and left faster, afraid the land might change its mind. But here they moved with a quiet patience, each canteen filled, each hand steady, as if the lesson was no longer about taking, but about knowing when enough had been reached. Wyatt mounted again without a word, the leather creaking softly beneath him, the familiar weight of the filled canteen resting against his side like something returned, not earned, just given back in time. He glanced once at the small pool behind them, now ringed with darker earth, a quiet mark in a wide land that would likely be gone again in a few weeks, hidden under dust until someone else who knew how to look came through. "We ride," Gideon Vale said, not loud, not sharp, just certain, and the line responded in that same measured way. Men settling into saddles, reins gathered, the column shifting forward as one. Wyatt nudged his horse ahead, taking the lead without ceremony, the ridge now behind them, the land opening again into long stretches of pale ground that shimmered under the noon sun. The air felt different now, not cooler, not kinder, but less desperate, as if the presence of water, even briefly, had eased something deeper than the body. They rode in silence for a while, the rhythm of hooves steady, the kind of silence that did not press, did not demand to be filled. After a mile, maybe 2, Lieutenant Pierce guided his horse up beside Wyatt, not close enough to crowd, just near enough to speak without raising his voice. "You did not drink first," he said, more observation than question. Wyatt kept his eyes forward. "I knew where it was," he replied. "The men digging did not." The lieutenant considered that, then nodded slowly. "Most men would have taken a sip before trusting it," he said. Wyatt shrugged once. "Most men do not spend their lives learning how little they need to hold on to," he said. Pierce fell quiet after that, his gaze drifting ahead, his understanding shifting in small ways he could not yet put into words. Behind them, Gideon Vale watched the exchange, not intruding, just listening, the same way he had listened in the dust outside the saloon, the same way he had listened when a single choice had been made without witness or reward. The miles stretched on, but they did not feel as long now, not because the distance had changed, but because the purpose had settled into each step, each breath, each turn of the wheel in the supply wagons that followed at a distance. By late afternoon, the outline of the next settlement began to appear, small structures scattered near a dry bend, thin lines of smoke rising from a few chimneys, the kind of place that held on because it had to, not because it was easy. As they approached, a few figures stepped out, cautious at first, then still as they recognized the uniforms, the line of riders, the quiet order that moved with them. Wyatt slowed his horse, raising a hand slightly, guiding the column to ease their pace, not to arrive like a force, but like something steadier, something that brought what was needed without taking more than it gave. A woman stood near the edge of the settlement, a tin bucket in her hand, eyes searching the line until they settled on the canteens, on the wagons, on the simple truth of what had come with them. Wyatt caught that look, Not fear, not surprise, just a tired kind of hope that had learned not to expect too much. He reached down, loosened the cap of his canteen, then held it out slightly as he rode past, not stopping, not making a show of it, just offering it the same way he had the day before, quiet, direct, without weight. The woman hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped forward and took it, her fingers careful, her eyes meeting his just long enough to say something words were not needed for. Wyatt did not linger. He did not wait for thanks. He let the reins guide him forward, the column following, the sound of hooves and wheels filling the space between what had been and what would come next. Behind him, the settlement began to move, people gathering, voices rising softly, not in panic, not in celebration, but in the kind of relief that did not need to be loud to be real. Gideon Vale brought his horse alongside Wyatt once more, his gaze moving from the people to the man riding ahead of him. "You did it again," he said quietly. Wyatt did not turn. "No," he replied. "It is the same thing." The general studied him for a moment, then inclined his head slightly, as if accepting that answer as the only one that mattered. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground, stretching them out behind the riders as they moved deeper into the land. And in that fading light, there was no difference between a man who wore a uniform and a man who did not. Only the quiet measure of what each chose to carry, and what each chose to give away when it mattered most.